As a truck driver, I've experienced my fair share of creepy encounters on the road, but nothing quite like the story I'm about to share with you. It was a warm summer night back in 2018, and I was driving through a remote area of West Virginia. I had been on the road for hours and was starting to feel a bit fatigued when I saw her, a young woman hitchhiking on the side of the road. Feeling sorry for her, I pulled over and offered her a ride. She thanked me and climbed into the cab. I noticed right away that she was wearing a fancy white dress, which struck me as odd. It was a warm night, and most people would have been wearing something a bit more casual. I asked her if she was okay, and she didn't respond. I figured maybe she was just tired or didn't speak much English, so I decided to focus on the road ahead. As we drove along, I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. There was something about the girl that didn't sit right with me. She was shivering, even though it was warm, and she still hadn't said a word. I tried to start up a conversation, but she just stared straight ahead, not acknowledging my words. We were about halfway through our journey when she suddenly said, "Stop here." I quickly stopped the truck on the side of the road. She looked straight at me, nodded, and got out of the truck. Already confused by her attire and silence, I thought, let's watch where she goes, because we were still far away from any population. But when I looked in my rearview mirror, to my horror, she had disappeared. Just like that, without a sound, she was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of her anywhere. My heart was pounding as I climbed out of the truck and searched the area. By now, I was convinced that I had encountered something terrible. But as I searched, I couldn't find any sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Feeling a sense of dread, I got back into the truck and continued driving. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed to be moving. It was like I was being followed. A few tense minutes passed, and just as I was getting back to my senses, I began to notice something odd. The same girl I had picked up was now standing on the side of the road, a few miles up ahead. I couldn't believe my eyes. How was this possible? I had just seen her disappear, and now she was back on the side of the road. It was like she was haunting me. I tried to ignore her and focus on the road, but the girl kept appearing every few miles. Each time I saw her, I felt my fear grow stronger. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew that it was something unnatural. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over and got out of the cab, determined to confront the girl and find out what was going on. But as I got out from my side of the truck and circled to the passenger side from the front of the truck to confront her, she vanished into thin air once again. I was completely freaked out at this point. I had no idea what was happening, and I was starting to think that I was losing my mind. I got back into my truck and decided to drive as fast as I could to the nearest truck stop, hoping that I could get some help or at least some answers. As I pulled into the truck stop, I was relieved to see other people around. I parked my truck and went inside, hoping to find some solace. But as I walked in, I saw her again, the same girl I had picked up earlier. She was sitting at a table, staring straight ahead, just like she had in my truck. I couldn't believe it. How was this possible? Was she a ghost? Had I somehow picked up a hitchhiking spirit? I couldn't take it anymore, so I instantly retraced my footsteps, got into the truck, and drove away. To this day, I can't comprehend what happened that night. Was it a ghostly encounter or just a figment of my imagination? I may never know for sure, but one thing is certain, I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of things on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one night on a long haul from Maine to California. I was transporting a load of antique dolls, a job I had done many times before without incident. But as I drove through the night, something felt different. I felt like I was being watched, and the dolls seemed to be staring at me, almost as if they were alive. I shook my head and tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. Then, things got even weirder when I started hearing strange whispers. I thought I must be imagining things, but then I heard them moving. And before I knew it, all the dolls in the cargo area were moving and whispering to each other. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the truck, trying to catch my breath. I opened the back of the truck, expecting to find some sort of explanation for the movement of the dolls, but there was nothing. No wind, no bumps in the road, and no logical explanation for what was happening. That's when I realized that something sinister was going on. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that the dolls were possessed by some sort of malevolent force. I got back in the truck and tried to drive away, but the dolls seemed to be getting louder and more agitated. They were whispering things like, "We're coming for you and you can't escape us." I was terrified, and I knew I needed to do something to stop the dolls from taking over completely. I pulled over again and tried to think of a plan. That's when I remembered something I had heard about in a truck stop diner a few years back. A voodoo priestess who lived in the Louisiana bayou and was rumored to have the power to banish evil spirits. I had visited her once before, so I was confident she could help. Without thinking twice, I made a U-turn and headed south toward Louisiana. The dolls were still moving and whispering, but now I was determined to get them to their final destination, the voodoo priestess's shack in the heart of the swamp. As I drove, the dolls seemed to be getting more and more agitated. They were moving around more violently, and I could hear their whispers even over the roar of the engine. But I kept my eyes on the road and pushed on, knowing that the fate of my soul and the world could be hanging in the balance. Finally, I arrived at the voodoo priestess's shack. It was a ramshackle building made of wood and mud, with strange symbols painted on the walls. I got out of the truck and walked towards the door, feeling a sense of dread creeping up my spine. The door creaked open, and I was confronted by the voodoo priestess. She was a short, wizened old woman with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul. I explained my situation to her, and she nodded knowingly. "I can help you," she said in a deep, raspy voice. She led me to a back room filled with strange objects, bones, feathers, candles, and other things I couldn't identify. She began to chant in a language I didn't understand, and as she did, the dolls in the back of the truck grew even more agitated. I could hear them screeching and screaming, trying to break free. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and the chanting stopped. I turned to see the voodoo priestess holding a doll in her hand, its head twisted completely around. She handed it to me and said, "They're possessed by the spirits of the dead, and they're not happy. But I can banish them back to where they came from if you're willing to help." I nodded, feeling a sense of determination wash over me. The voodoo priestess instructed me to place 10 dolls on a table in front of her, one by one, while she chanted and performed a ritual. As I did, I could feel the energy in the room shifting, and the dolls grew quieter and stiller. Finally, we reached the last doll. It was a particularly old and ornate one, with a face that seemed to glare at me accusingly. I hesitated, but the voodoo priestess urged me to place it on the table. As soon as I did, the room exploded in a burst of light and sound. I was thrown back against the wall, and the voodoo priestess let out a scream that echoed through the swamp. When I opened my eyes, the dolls were gone, and the voodoo priestess was lying on the ground, motionless. I rushed to her side, feeling a sense of panic and guilt wash over me. Had I caused her death by bringing the possessed dolls to her? But as I knelt beside her, she stirred and opened her eyes. "You did it," she said weakly. "The dolls are gone. But be warned, they were not alone. There are many other spirits out there, waiting to possess anything they can. You must be careful, or you will meet a fate worse than death." With that, she closed her eyes and signaled me to go away. I knew I had to get her help, but I also knew that she was right. The world was full of dark forces, and I had just had a brush with them. I left the voodoo priestess's shack and got back in my truck, feeling a sense of relief and exhaustion wash over me. The road ahead seemed less daunting now, but I knew that I would never forget the possessed cargo that had almost cost me my life. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what else was out there, waiting to possess me. And how could I protect myself from the forces of darkness that seemed to be lurking around every corner? Only time would tell, but for now, I was just grateful to be alive. As a truck driver, I was used to long hours on the road, but this particular night was starting to feel more eerie than usual. As I made my way down the road, I suddenly heard a loud bang and felt my truck shudder beneath me. My heart sank as I realized that my truck had broken down. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried to assess the damage, but I soon realized it was of no use. My truck needed some serious repairs. I knew that I had to find a garage as soon as possible. I felt I was in luck when I saw a sign up ahead for a small garage just a few miles down the road. I somehow managed to limp my truck to the garage and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw that the lights were still on. As I walked into the garage, I was greeted by the sight of a gruff-looking mechanic. He introduced himself as Jack. He looked like he had seen better days. Jack was a burly man with a thick beard and greasy overalls. He gave me a nod and I explained my situation. Jack seemed friendly enough, and I felt like I could trust him. As Jack worked on my truck, I sat down in the waiting area, scrolling through my phone and trying to pass the time. But every once in a while, I glanced up to check on Jack's progress. That's when I noticed something strange. Jack was muttering to himself, his eyes fixed on his tools as he sharpened them with an almost manic intensity. I tried to shrug it off as just another mechanic's quirk, but something about his behavior made me uneasy. Hours passed, and I was starting to get restless. I asked Jack if my truck was ready yet, and he simply grunted in response. That's when I noticed the way he was looking at me, with a kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. I quickly paid him and made a beeline for my truck. But before I could even get the engine started, Jack lunged at me with a wrench in his hand. I barely managed to dodge his attack, my heart racing as I realized what was happening. We grappled for a few moments, with me desperately trying to defend myself against Jack's massive frame. But with a sudden burst of strength, I managed to land a punch that sent him sprawling to the ground. I knew I had to get out of there before he could come after me again. I quickly scrambled into my truck and started the engine, peeling out of the garage with tires screeching. As I drove away, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It felt like something out of a nightmare. Soon enough, I decided to do some digging and asked around about Jack. It turns out that he had a dark past. He had been previously convicted of robbery and attempted murder, and the rumor was that he had been killing and robbing truckers for years and had somehow managed to get away with it until now. I couldn't believe that I had been so close to becoming one of his victims. The thought of what could have happened to me sent a shiver down my spine. Looking back on that night, I realized just how lucky I was to have escaped with my life. It was a scary experience that I will never forget. I often think about what could have happened if I hadn't been able to land that punch. But I know that I was lucky and that I will never take my safety for granted again. It was a night that haunted me for months to come. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, my heart racing as I relived the moment when Jack had attacked me. I had never felt so vulnerable and helpless before. I decided to take some time off from trucking to clear my head and recuperate from the trauma. I spent a few weeks with my family, trying to forget the horrors of that night. When I finally decided to hit the road again, I made sure to take extra precautions. I invested in a dashcam and started carrying pepper spray with me at all times. I also made sure to stay in contact with my family and friends, checking in with them regularly. Despite my efforts to stay safe, I still found myself on edge whenever I encountered a stranger on the road. Every time I pulled over at a rest stop or gas station, I found myself scanning my surroundings, looking for any signs of danger. Months turned into years, and I slowly started to feel more comfortable on the road again. But the memory of that night with Jack still lingered, a constant reminder that danger could strike at any moment. It wasn't until years later that I found out what had happened to Jack. I was passing through the area where his garage had been located when I heard a news report on the radio. They had found Jack's body in a ditch, his throat slit from ear to ear. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Despite the fear and anger that I had felt towards Jack for what he had done to me, I never wanted to see anyone meet such a gruesome end. If you enjoyed this spine-tingling horror video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest content. And if you dare, leave a comment below with your thoughts on the video or any chilling experiences of your own. Thank you for watching.